60% of record buyers in this country don't own a record player. I don't think this country's produced a truly global pop star since Dua Lipa in 2017. Anyone listening or watching this podcast thinking, how do I get into this business? Please don't wait for your job description. Create your job description.
Hi, I'm Hazel Savage, and today I'm talking to Will Page, who is the economist and author, former Chief Economist of Spotify and PRS for Music. In this episode today, you'll learn about a brand new article out in the Financial Times where Will values the music industry at $41.5 billion. We will also be talking about glocalisation as an industry trend, and we touch on gender diversity. So thank you so much for joining me here today, Will. Absolute pleasure to talk to you.
I've travelled all the way from downstairs where my office is, so...
Fabulous. I have travelled all the way from Leeds, and you know I'm a big fan of the North East Railways.
Yes.
But we're not here to talk about the trains today. I wanted to jump straight in on the article that's grabbing the attention this week, the industry valuation. And it's getting you quite a few headlines here. Have I got the number right? Was it 41 billion?
$41.5 billion.
41.5 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd love to talk a little bit about how you've approached that valuation. And, you know, does it give us a kind of a guiding star to work towards? Is it inspirational, or is it just quite matter of fact? How do you approach it?
It's educational, and that's my passion, is teaching economics of this business, particularly to an audience who doesn't think they're going to understand it, probably doesn't want to understand it, but has to.
Right.
And the way that I write the article, and full credit to my copy editor, Sam Blake, for making it so readable, is to get this number and what this number means to that audience. And the origins of it, we're going back here 9 years to the early days of Spotify, was a sense of frustration that we always measured Spotify's contribution to the business in what we paid record labels. I kept saying to Daniel, but we don't just pay record labels, we pay publishers and we pay collecting societies as well. So what's our entire contribution to copyright relative to the market? And that's where this work came from, essentially adding these three jigsaw pieces together. Firstly, the IFPI yearbook, which captures what record labels made and revenues. Yep. Secondly, the CZAC Global Collections Report, that's the collecting societies, the PRS, the ASCAPs, the BMIs of this world. And thirdly, the more complex area, which is publishers, their direct collections that are getting outside of the collecting society. So if you think about Sony Music Publishing has Solar, which would license SoundCloud, it would be that entity there that we're capturing there. So when you add these three pieces together, that's the easy part. Where you have to go into your back cave, eat cold pizza, drink flat Coca-Cola for a month, is how to do all the adjustments.
Right.
Once you've done all that, I won't bore you with the details, you can then produce this figure, which is $41.5 billion. And I think it's remarkable to tell this industry, this C with a circle called copyright begins with a 4.
Yeah.
When I started this, it barely began with a 2. Now it begins with a 4. It's a time to take stock. And what gives me so much pleasure with the work, Hazel, is the awareness it's captured. Sometimes you get a top story, Music Business Worldwide, Music Ally, Music and Copyright, the trade publications. This year, for 6 hours, it was top story in the Financial Times. And then bad news in Gaza took over, understandably. But for 6 hours, I was a top story in the Financial Times. Yeah. Probably thanks to a beautiful picture of Dua Lipa, and less due to my geeky economic work. But to hit the headlines that way shows that we're not just a niche industry anymore.
Yeah.
We're not just the poor cousin of the media verticals. We can stand tall and take pride of what we've achieved, SoundCloud included.
Well, that's what really caught my eye, especially, you know, being so prominent with the Financial Times as a publication. But back to what you just mentioned there about back at your time at Spotify, do you think that the, you know, just basically simplifying it down to, and not just at Spotify, a relationship between the copyright and we pay labels, did we describe it in just that one simple sentence because we didn't know, or because it's so much easier for education if we simplify things?
I think it's a large part that we've just misunderstood. And I mean, we, industry professionals, equally the investors who are pumping millions of pounds into music catalogues, and similarly the students. This is a complex business. And the job of economics is what I call straighten out the spaghetti. Like, how do you track all this? But at the very highest level, there are essentially two rights in a song. There's a label and the artist, the master rights. Then there's the songwriter and the publisher, the underlying copyright. And there's subdivisions within that, communication to the public and making available. But at the very highest level, we need to be aware that this music industry is more than just the IFPI yearbook. We need to be aware that if you're performing on stage at a concert and you're performing my songs, me as a songwriter deserves to get paid. It's how this value chain holds together. And Hazel, if there's one word to describe this industry, it's reciprocity. It's the biggest I scratch your back and you scratch mine industry I've ever seen in my life.
Right.
And for good reason, because we're dependent on each other. Artists need songwriters to write the songs that they're going to perform. Labels need publishers to publish the songs that they're going to record. And it's just, I think what this 41.5 billion figure does is not just capture the value, but capture the reciprocity within the industry.
I think you're right. That sort of that concept of, like you say, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Our whole industry in the past has been built on the kind of the who you know and the relationships you have.
Yeah.
Which I think is fascinating.
I always remember the greatest lesson I learned is today's receptionist is tomorrow's new boss. So be polite to everybody.
100%. And I certainly have had the pleasure this year of working with an intern who I fully expect to be my boss one day, as it should be. So I know we sort of jumped straight in there because I was so excited to talk about the Financial Times advert. But for those, and I'm sure they're few and far between, how did you come into this business? What's your sort of potted career history, or the Will Page elevator pitch, as I like to call it?
The hop, skip and jump through what is 15, 16 years down here in the southeast of England. Always passionate about music. Have been making mixtapes since puberty. And got my first break in the business to write for a publication called Straight No Chaser, which if it was around today would be a huge champion of the artists that you find on SoundCloud. It was dedicated to jazz, rap, soul, electronica, world music. And bizarrely, from a bedroom in Edinburgh, I spent a lot of my time covering Philadelphia hip-hop bands, which sounds strange. At the time, I was
super niche as well. I love it.
Yeah. At the time, I was a government economist going to work in a black suit, blue shirt, red tie, working for Gordon Brown in the Treasury. And at night, I'm covering Philadelphia rap acts. During that whole period, I kept on interviewing with the industry to say, would you hire an economist? And the answer was a flat out no. We hire lawyers, we hire marketing people, but we have no need for economics. And I kept saying, but your business is falling off a cliff. These are the early noughties where piracy was upending our industry. Copyright is the right to copy, and piracy had removed that right to copy. There is an economic problem that we need to solve here. Never got anywhere. Got rejected maybe 10, 12 times. Never stopped knocking on doors. Never stopped getting rejections. Then, to tell a very brief story, on the 16th of March 2006, I get on the bus in Edinburgh to go home. 35 bus, get towards the seat, and I see a Financial Times on the bus. And I don't usually pick up newspapers on buses, but it's a Financial Times. Benefits outweigh the costs. And I'm reading through this paper, and the last article I see says, Digital Ants Wreck the Music Industry's Picnic. Oh, that's the type of thing I'm working on in my bedroom. How is the economics of this business causing so much upheaval? Read the article. Who wrote it? Adam Singer, Chief Executive of the Performing Rights Society. What on earth does that organisation do? And my dad raised me never to be shy approaching anyone. Could be the king, could be the bin man. You just use your courtesy, your manners, and you see where it takes you. And I wrote him a letter to correct him on his article. He had some mistakes in it. A week later, this phone call comes through the government switchboard, and it says it's Adam Singer, very important chief executive, wanting to speak to me. And the first thing he acknowledged about my corrections was that he was dyslexic. He said, when you have an increase in supply, barriers to entry fall. I said, no, the barriers to entry have to fall before you can have an increase in supply. This is an ordering correction. Your point's valid, we just need to change the order. So how humble of him just to open up to dyslexia in a call with a complete stranger. And we got talking. He brought me to London, interviewed me for an entire day. The interview went really well, went home at the weekend. And my sister Annie was like, calm your enthusiasm, you're going to get rejected again. And on the Monday morning was made Chief Economist of the PRS. And I tell that story to say two things. One, had I not picked up that newspaper on a bus, I would not be sitting with Hazel Savage here at Talyard X Studios. And two, to quote the last line of my book, and I give this to anyone listening or watching this podcast, especially the students studying, thinking, how do I get into this business? Please, don't wait for your job description. Create your job description. Case closed. Anyone who advertises for a job doesn't know what they're hiring. You tell them what you're bringing, and you'll go much further.
I absolutely love that. And I not only do I love the sort of the butterfly effect from that you picked up that newspaper, just a
It's
simple
surreal.
split-second
And we
decision.
keep the exact copy on our wall in our house.
I
It's
love
faded
that.
a bit. It's no longer pink, but yeah, the real copy.
Yes, and just from such a specific moment to, you know, that real connection and such a fantastic sort of getting that first role. And I imagine you had to move down to London for it as well. Was that part of it?
Yeah, that was a big one. Is leaving Scotland and from the Scottish borders, my town's got more sheep than people, and then coming to this huge city which has got 3 times the population of Scotland, and trying to make sense of it all, and the pace and everything else. Well, that takes some adjustment, but you know, I made it work. And at the PRS, I got some big breaks. I mean, some of the big ones were debunking the long tail theory, showing that when we offer more choice, we want more hits. In the cover story of The Economist, quotes me today on that piece of work that I did in 2007. Working with Radiohead on In Rainbows, the voluntary tip jar model, super important to SoundCloud, Patreon, Kickstarter. We're still learning lessons from that to this day. And then really important for me was doing the economic evidence to help save BBC Six Music. And as somebody who goes jogging to the Huey show every Saturday morning on Six Music, I'm really proud I was able to show how Six Music does something that the market doesn't. It offers more choice than commercial radio was offering at the time. It's quite bizarre. Mark Thompson used to dine out on that evidence because I showed that Six Music played 3,000 unique songs a month. And Radio 2 was next with 2,000. Radio Scotland was next with 1,800. Radio 1, 900. And the station that gave you the least choice was called Choice FM.
Ironically.
I get text messages from people in America saying, you're still using that slide, Will? But using evidence is what the policymakers needed to make a decision, not the emotional arguments. Save Six Music is an emotional argument.
Yeah.
Presenting evidence is far more persuasive for a policymaker to say, this entity is doing something the market otherwise wouldn't. That's where I saw the power of music economics.
So, and I think this is I've seen this across our entire industry, and I say our industry, I'm referring to music industry more broadly, is even when I started 18 years ago, it was much more emotionally driven, much more opinion driven. And then suddenly there was this shift towards data, hard numbers, and making decisions based on what the data tells us. And so you've really not only been a part of that shift, but you've lived it as well. And so do you sort of remember when it crystallized that you saw that change happen?
Yeah, I think there's 2 big milestones for me, which I think your audience would really benefit from. Is you mentioned 18 years. Well, you're more of a veteran than me, but if you go back to the late 90s, early noughties, when the CD sales were at their peak, when the record label execs were taking helicopters to their private jets, there's a wonderful story, which I fact-checked for my book, actually, which is that record shops would buy CDs from record labels by the, quotes, weight of pallet. So I'm a record label, you're Our Price or Tower Records, I got a pallet of CDs. You don't say, what's on there? You say, how much does it weigh?
Right.
About 30 kilos. I'll give you this much for it. And they literally traded intellectual property by weight of pallet of CDs. Now, Hazel, given your esteemed history in artificial intelligence and music, how much data sciences are in a weight of pallet of CDs?
It's a very minimalist number.
Right.
It's got me thinking around how many pages are in each of the CD booklets, and that's really going to affect the weight of the palette. And now I'm starting to think that's why they really padded them out with all the lyrics. Possibly.
Put extra stickers on them.
Exactly, yeah. There's a sales sticker and a bonus sticker, and then just a fun sticker.
But how does this industry, I mean, it was bigger then than it is to this day if you adjust by inflation, but how did we get away with it? How was it that easy? It's Shania Twain, it's Robson and Jerome, it's all going to sell. You buy CDs by the way. Roll that forward to Spotify, and a very, very important story for me in understanding the role of economics at Spotify and streaming more generally at SoundCloud, Apple, Amazon, and YouTube was understanding what it meant when you're dealing with consumption analytics. Weight of CDs is transaction analytics. You buy a CD, did you open it? Did you break your nails when you opened it? That's a very important question to ask. Did you listen
frequently?
Did you bite your nails before you opened it and couldn't get to the CD? But then, how often did you play it? Did you play it more than once? Did you play all the songs? But we didn't know. It was an upfront transaction and consumption was lost in the ether. When you start to understand consumption analytics, the game changes overnight. And the best way to explain this was the first chart I ever did at Spotify, which was in 2012. We did the most streamed album chart. Fairly obvious. Number 1 was Gaultier, a Belgian-Australian artist.
Yep.
And number 8 was Lana Del Rey.
Right.
So then, after looking at what was the most streamed album, a mathematician colleague at Spotify, Chris Tynan, brilliant guy who taught us all maths in the company, he said to us, we could do a trick here and say, how much of that album was consumed? How would we do that? We'll take the median track. So there's 11 tracks on the album. We're going to re-rank the album chart by the 6th most popular track to ask how many of the songs we got into.
Yeah.
Now, going back to Gaultier, I noticed you remembered that name.
I do. Somebody I used to know.
Right, great. You've answered the questions I used to know. So question 2, and I've got a 100% track record here, and there's been no preparation for audience's benefit. Can you name a second Gaultier track?
No.
Do you know I asked his publisher and they couldn't either?
Yeah.
Right. So when we did it by median rank to ask the question, how much of this album's been consumed, because streaming is consumption analytics, Gaultier went from number 1 to number 58.
Right.
Lana Del Rey went from number 8 to number 1. And that tells you Gaultier's just a one-hit wonder.
Yep.
That tells you all of Lana Del Rey's fans love all of her songs. And that's crucial. And that right there made me think the world is just about to change. Because we're not selling CDs by the weight of pellet anymore. We're monetizing consumption.
Yeah. You look at the data through one lens, you're getting one story, which is the Gaultier album at number 1. Through another lens, there's another artist, Lana Del Rey, that we should be focusing on. And if you were working in the industry, if you wanted to know
if Hazel Savage was a festival promoter saying, I'm going to book these artists,
exactly.
Well, give Gaultier 3 minutes and 48 seconds on stage and give Lana Del Rey an extra hour for encores, because we know that all her fans want to hear all of her songs. And just one very important footnote to that story, quite bizarrely, not only was Gaultier a one-hit wonder, but the one hit that he had was sued for copyright infringement by a Brazilian composer called Luis Bonfa, and a track called Seville. So you lost all his publishing on the one hit that you had.
I'm starting to feel quite bad for Gaultier now. But I remember as well when because I remember that particular track coming out, I was working for Universal Music in Australia.
Wow.
So it was the kind of the hot new thing, and I was kind of right at the center of it, which is why I remember the name of the track so well. But I couldn't name a second hit. Do you know what? Another interesting thing, the video for that song was iconic.
Yeah.
With the drawing of the lines and the shading in of the face.
Beautiful, it's entrancing.
And we could just get onto a whole section of, but there's probably no money in music videos.
Yeah, and can I also just add the production of it? I am absolutely sure, and we have to go back in time, what is it now, 13 years since that hit actually was written and released? I think that song was designed to sound good on old Apple MacBooks with the tinny sound with no bass in theory, because at that point Mac stopped allowing CD players to go in. And it's just interesting to think about, did we have speaker systems? Were we Bluetooth enabled around then? I think a lot of people loved that song because it sounded good just coming out of a laptop with no extra bass, no surround sound.
Yeah, it was
none
very
of the special
trebly.
facilities we have here at Taliard X. It was just very, very trebly, very hollow.
Yeah.
So I also think there's something else in music in terms of the jockey's only as good as the horse, the song's only as good as the amplification system you've got to
definitely. And well, there's I know I've heard just anecdotally people say that different sounds work better at different resolutions, and that the younger generation are used to lower fidelity audio. So there's definitely a trend there as well. I feel a second book or a third book coming on at some point, Will.
After I speak to you, I'm calling my agent. Yeah.
Great stuff. I'll help pitch in the idea. So next, on to glocalisation. For the benefit of those people listening in who might not have heard the term before, give us the Will Page 101 on glocalisation.
Well, for the benefit of the audience, your northern accent can pronounce it, mine can't. We have a glocal stop, so we struggle.
How do you say it?
Glocalisation. I can't say I invented this word for a wider audience and still can't pronounce it. What does it mean? So what we've seen explicitly, and since publishing this, what was going to be just a trivial discussion paper for the London School of Economics, it's gone absolutely viral, is that local bands are getting to the top of their local charts in their local mother tongue on global platforms. What we didn't see in the past was this happen with local record shops and local radio stations. So the global part is the fact that these platforms, SoundCloud, Spotify, are global. The local part is local. And I was in Denmark last week, and all the bands I saw in Denmark that are cruising up the top of the charts are performing in Danish, a country of 5 million people. It's there, it's everywhere. So let's just revisit what we looked at. Firstly, where does the origins of this word come from? It comes from a sociologist. And this is very important as you unpack this story. It does not belong with me, the dozy economist. It belongs with sociology, anthropology, people who understand other people with pulses. Forget the Excel spreadsheets that I work with. And this sociologist was Roland Robertson at the University of Aberdeen. And what he observed in the 1990s was, if globalization is true and the world is flat, everybody should be going to McDonald's and Starbucks. That's how the theory works. And he looked at the Korean population in Los Angeles and said, well, why are they going to Korean restaurants and Korean delis? Because they want to go where it feels like home. And that's where you have the local community rejecting globalization trends through having their own little mini village of K-Town in Los Angeles. That's 1995. This is 2023. So my paperback of my book Pivot was released on the 5th of February. And here at Talyard, the BBC came and introduced me for the One Show. Why an author of economics is on the BBC One Show, which is our family, feel-good, friendly TV show, I don't quite
You were
understand.
the highbrow section.
Yeah, if you're a first-time author completely out of depth, you take whatever promotion you can get. And that was a great win to get onto that show.
Absolutely.
But the feel-good family story was, hey, Will, isn't it great that last year the top 10 artists in Britain were all British? For the first time ever in 60 years, Britain got a clean sweep of the top 10. And I made a complete, I think the American term is douchebag of myself, because rather than celebrate this story, I pointed out that no, because the top 10 in Germany were all German, the top 10 in Italy were all Italian, the top 10 in France were all French, and the top 10 in Spain were all Spanish language, but Latin American. This isn't just a British success story. This is a European phenomena where local artists are dominating the tops of their local charts. And everyone gulps on the sofa, didn't do my book sales any favour, but the reaction made me think, there's something in that observation. Okay, I've screwed up any chance of selling more copies of my book, but something in that reaction which suggests where there's smoke, there's fire. I want to smell out this story more. Worked with a co-author, Chris Dalla Riva, brilliant writer, great Substack that you should follow, and explored this event of glocalisation, which kind of shows what we're seeing today, which is, the English-speaking world used to have it easy. It used to have it really easy. Everybody just hoarded up our English-speaking acts from Britain, America, Canada. Not anymore, my friend.
Yeah.
And I'll wrap it up and put a pin in it with this observation. I would argue, as Britain is one of the 4 net exporting music markets in the world, the other 3 being United States, obviously, Sweden, you might not have known of, and more recently South Korea, that we used to knock out global hits all the time. Here's an Adele, here's a Coldplay, here's a Snow Patrol, here's an Oasis. I don't think this country's produced a truly global pop star since Dua Lipa in 2017. Now I look at my watch, that was a bloody long time ago for it to be dry. And it's not our fault, it's glocalisation.
The market's changed.
The market's changed. German festivals are selling out with German bands headlining German stages, performing in German. They're not listening to our language anymore. And I think this is where I have to stop and say, someone else, some other discipline, take the baton and explain it. I can just lay the economic foundations. But if I can toss a few out, I think on the supply side, what we've seen is that there's less costs. SoundCloud, the tools that you're creating, reduce the cost of getting to market.
Yep.
There's more data science. I'm not waiting on radio log sheets that are 5 months old, which is how the industry worked for decades. Now SoundCloud, Spotify, you guys are giving us real-time data. And there's less global prioritization. So that's a supply side effect. On the demand side, the consumer used to get what they were given. We all had to listen to Chris Evans' breakfast radio show. We all had to listen to Paolo Nutini together, whether we liked him or not. And we'd all discuss that around a water cooler at 10 o'clock in the morning when we took our breaks. Now we choose what we want. We vote with our attention. And what Europeans are voting for is their own content in their own language.
So to follow on from that, and now you've kind of outlined it, to me, I think, of course, that makes perfect sense. Who are the biggest winners? Is it the consumer that wins from choice? Or are there certain artists or acts or countries that are the biggest beneficiaries of this kind of shift?
the biggest winner, I think, is the consumer, because they are voting with their attention. They're choosing what they want.
Yeah.
And we have to be very careful about when we sort of apply discretion onto consumer choices. One example of they're just listening to lean back music all the time. Well, if they're paying for it, that's their choice. If they're consuming adverts to support it, that's their choice. The fact they're not listening to what the previous gatekeeper would have played sounds to me or smells to me like, dare I say, a bit of jealousy going on. We used to have this power, now we don't. The biggest loser of all of this, bizarrely, and I'm switching lanes quite dramatically here, is regulation. If you think about the French market, everyone knows the French regulate their media.
Yep.
1 in every 4 songs played on radio has to be French, performed in French.
Yep.
Can't be a French band performing in English, has to be performed in French. And the French charts, typically in the age of radio and CD sales, were dominated by Anglo-American acts. Today, in streaming, they're all French. So the free market, the unregulated market of streaming, has achieved what the regulated market radio has failed, which is domestic prominence. Now, I can flip that to the home country for SoundCloud, Germany. I was in Berlin and Hamburg for the Reeperbahn Festival, presenting in German, by the way, to the German government this topic.
That's exciting.
It was tough. The verb comes at the end, which means translation is a lengthy process. But the key point that we had there is absolutely jaw-dropping. Of last year, the top 100 songs on radio in Germany, guess how many of those 100 songs were German acts?
Well, based on some of the stats you've just given me, I'm going to say 80 out of 100.
0. Not one.
Right.
None. It's staggering. When you look at streaming, it's broadly speaking about half. Not all performing in German, most are, but around half of the top 100 acts on streaming last year were German, none of the top 100 on radio. And the Minister for the German government asked the head of radio in German, how can this be true? You've seen Will's evidence, back to what we discussed earlier, the role of evidence. You know, there it is, there's a top 100 songs, and all I'm seeing is British and American and Canadian acts. And he said, we just have to sell commercials. Is that your answer? Is that as far as this one goes? So again, Germany regulates radio. It doesn't regulate streaming. And what's the free market achieved that the regulated markets failed? Domestic prominence. This is the bigger issue for me as an economist. There's cultural issues, there's societal issues.
Yeah, of course.
But the bigger issue for me is the one of regulation. Why has this happened, given it's a free market without any intervention from the state?
And there's a real gap there, isn't there? Between, like you say, you're 50% on streaming and 0 on radio.
0.
What a gulf. and so that's one of the challenges for that market in particular to address, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet, well done you for doing the talk in German. That's very impressive. I know you were talking a little bit before about France, and one of the most interesting talks I ever did, I had a live translator because I do not speak French, unfortunately. And so I had someone translating everything I was saying in real time into French, into the headsets of the people in the audience. And I was just obsessed with it. I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. So I started talking about it, which meant that the translator was then talking about themselves. And I said, and you're doing a great job, which I'm sure that she then also had to translate. But how lucky we are to live in Europe and have all of this on our doorstep. Well, okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much for the chat about glocalisation. I love the terminology. I love when new words like this come into the market.
And can I just quickly stress there as well?
Of course.
The way that and it's just an LSE discussion paper, apparently one of the most read papers on the London School of Economics website, which I think speaks volumes about how badly put together the website is. It's not my paper that deserves that, but it's travelling.
Yeah.
Like the film industry in South Korea is now asking me to go out to Seoul and explain this phenomena because South Koreans don't watch Hollywood movies anymore. I didn't expect it to touch that nerve. It has.
Yeah.
And I want to uncover it. And I'd love to come back to your podcast this time next year, maybe present an update on what we've learned since publishing that paper.
100%. And
we've opened up the hornet's nest.
Going into film and TV is interesting as well, because obviously we have predictions around the value of the music industry, but if you broaden that out to the creative industries, it's a much bigger industry.
Huge.
So that's fascinating as well. The next thing I did want to jump on, because I know it's a particular passion of yours as well, quick old chat about vinyl. So are you a collector?
Yes. It's ridiculous.
Do you have any
In
stats?
alphabetical, chronological order, about 4,000 at the moment. So
You knew that was what I was going to ask. I was like, what's the count? Where are we up to?
yeah, I think we're nudging towards 4,000.
This also means, I imagine, that you can never move house.
I moved house last year and moving that vinyl record collection. The removal firm can move pianos, it can move kitchens, and they looked at this record collection and said, what are we going to do with this? So I'm touching that. You guys lift the heavy stuff,
Leave
I'll
it.
move the records. Yeah. But yeah, it's a very, very important part of my life, vinyl. And the resurgence is quite dramatic. I mean,
Yeah.
on an average, I'd say a British record label, £1 in every 10 is coming
Yeah.
from vinyls. For savvy independents, it could be as much as a quarter of their business is vinyl. And we have to kind of ask, why is it happening? And I'm tempted to say the true reason is because you can't roll up a spliff on an MP3 file. So that was the original purpose for vinyl, I think, if I go back to my Stone Age youth. More importantly, the stat that always strikes me as baffling is that 60% of record buyers in this country don't own a record player. It's been consistent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's anecdotal, there's a bit of survey evidence, but it always seems to hover around more than half of the people buying this stuff. And remember what they're buying here. They don't have the technology to play this stuff.
Yeah.
They're willing to pay £10 a month to access 100 million songs on Spotify and £20 to buy just 10 of them. It's baffling. And the gut reaction for me is maybe this is a new form of merchandise. Maybe this is a form of intimacy. Maybe this is a way of expressing closeness to a band that you can't express when you touch a piece of glass and put it back in your pocket called a smartphone. But yeah, it's there. It cannot be ignored, and it carries on growing with every year. And I think there's a lot more room for this market to expand going forward. I don't think this is a blip. This is a long-term trend.
I think you're completely right. I think, well, I can tell you that I am part of the 60% who own vinyl but do not own a vinyl player.
Why?
I have plans to correct this. Will, I moved back from Singapore to the UK about a year and a half ago, and I never wanted to start a collection until I knew that I wouldn't have to ship it very, very far overseas and spend a lot of money. And, so when I have a permanent abode, the plan is to, yes, now it makes sense to set it up. But I have acquired a few vinyl over the years, purely because, one of my favourite bands that I absolutely love, Alkaline Trio, when they do a pre-order, quite often it'll be a bundle, like a T-shirt, a digital download, and then the gold disc of the vinyl. And it's either that, or you can just pre-order the digital download. Well, I am much more attracted to the bundle. I want the T-shirt, I want the vinyl, I want everything. It's a collector's item to me as a fan, even if I haven't got the record player yet. My intention is there to get the record player. But I probably have a handful where I've made these purchases as like a super fan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I often like to say that the internet can scale just about anything, but it can't scale intimacy. And if I want intimacy with my favourite bands, I can't achieve that through a smartphone engagement, which takes approximately 5 seconds every morning before I put it in my pocket and cycle to work. It's got to be something deeper. Maybe a couple of sort of footnotes on the vinyl resurgence, which are worthy for your audience to pick up on. If you go back to that Gochi example, remember how you allocate the royalties from vinyl is flat, because we don't know what you streamed or what you played. Or in your case, you ain't played nothing yet because...
Yet.
Yeah, but the mechanical publishing royalties have been allocated evenly. And my favourite example to teach that is the greatest selling vinyl record of all time was Saturday Night Fever. And on that record, there's a song called Calypso Strut by Ralph McDonald. And I can guarantee you, of all the 30 million people that have bought that double vinyl record, nobody's played Ralph McDonald's Calypso Strut. Nobody even knows it's there. It got the same royalty as the Bee Gees did for Staying Alive.
Right.
Because it was even.
Yeah.
So for people investing in catalogues, for artists and songwriters looking to get paid from this, if you've got a filler track on a vinyl record, you're cashing out. All those Goche songs got paid if you bought the vinyl. None of them got paid if you streamed the hit.
Of course.
So that's one distinction. And then the second one is to look at what's holding the business back and how that's going to move forward. In the $41.5 billion piece that we discussed at the top of the show, I talked about pressing business.
Yep.
which has set up Bill Hine and Fred Goldring in Poland, new pressing capacity.
Yeah.
They did Travis Scott, which is reportedly 500,000 double vinyls selling for $50 a pop, pressed before the release. Not, we've got a hot record here, let's pamper it with a vinyl strategy. Let's go all in on vinyl before the record drop. That in itself changes the game. The fact we're now doing pre-release vinyl press-ups. So A, you've got amazing new production capacity coming out of Poland. That helps resolve bottlenecks in vinyl. But B, you've also got the removal of the red tape. So you can work with pressing business to get around Brexit, for example. You can work with pressing business to get around tax laws in Mexico and Latin America. And I think it's the double whammy of A, we've got more production capacity coming online, and B, we're circumventing the red tape that's going to allow vinyl to go from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 in the next 2 or 3 years.
We are a creative industry, quite literally. We will get creative to find our ways around challenges and problems regardless.
Yeah, it's an adaptive story.
I love it. I love it. So I can't possibly have you on the podcast and chat to you, Will, without mentioning the famous 2 letters, AI. We simply must talk about AI. And I'd like to really kick off with, I know that you host your own podcast. I know that you've hit some absolutely phenomenal statistics there. And actually you yourself have become quite the expert at interviewing other AI businesses. What's your particular area of interest within the future of technology? What sort of excites you about it?
Well, if I take the podcast Bubble Trouble, distributed by Acast, and look at the 4 guests that we've had, and just maybe pull out a headline from each.
Yeah.
If I start with the company Boomi, that was a tricky one because they don't often do interviews. The company's under a lot of scrutiny just now. We got them, and that was a real feat. But the way that conversation started is worthy of your audience's attention, because Alex Mitchell said to me, Will, how many creators are on Spotify right now? I said, roughly speaking, 8 million. That's the public record. Great. Well, how many people are on planet Earth? Roughly speaking, 8 billion. I think that's on Wikipedia. So fine. It's not a big number, is it? 8 million creators and 8 billion people. Do the fractions. And that made me stop and think in terms of the educational role AI might have, which the lawyers and the hype and hysteria are missing, which is how many more people should be creators but are not, and how many of them would be if something like Boomi was to embrace them and give them the tools, the confidence to enter the creativity of music. That was just a show-stopping introduction. I couldn't actually finish the podcast after that. I had to go for a walk the dog around the block and think for it. 8 million creators, 8 billion people. It is not a large number.
Yeah.
Moving over to the company Make It, spelled MAYK.IT, Stefan Heinrich there, fantastic company, scaling, still in beta mode just now. But he posed a question to me, which was, and again, we're not going to get tangled up in the technicalities of AI, but the use case, he said, Will, why is it that teenagers today don't think twice about making video content? They're doing it on their way to school. Here's a video of me and my bestie at school. Let's send it to my other bestie who's ill and can't make it to school today to cheer them up. They don't think twice. They're making video content all the time. But we have to think about the law when it comes to making musical content. I was like, that's another show-stopping question where I have to go and walk the dog and think about it. Yeah, why is it kids today can make video content at the click of a finger, but have to think about copyright law when it comes to making musical content? How do we navigate that? And then Audio Shake, Jessica Powell, fascinating company as well. Just her, she writes and speaks beautifully. I could go to sleep listening to her TED Talks, but B,
I would, but I wouldn't want to sleep because I might miss something really important that she said. So I would wake myself back up.
But she just reminds ourselves of remix culture, which has always been in the industry. Remix culture has generated huge amounts of copyright value. So how do we embrace this new form of remix culture? It was a fake Drake track, just hype and hysteria about another form of remix. And then finally, Ed Newton-Rex at Stability. Fantastic to get him to be allowed to come on the podcast and tell his side of the story, but also to acknowledge his recent developments where he stepped down from Stability.
Absolutely.
One of 2 big departures in the world of AI. Maybe not the biggest.
It's been a busy week for the AI
He did
industry.
get on the BBC, but he doesn't trump Sam Altman's departure. But
not yet.
He had an issue with the lines, the blurry lines of fair use, and I thought that was a really interesting development to see somebody inside the business taking a stand on what is and what isn't fair use. But I mean, I think those 4 observations from 4 companies, and again, we can link to those shows. It's not boasting that we got these guests, but just it allows you to educate by listening to the people who are, like yourself, Hazel, doers, not armchair critics, but people who are actually out there in the field building product that can advance this. And I think those voices are not getting heard enough. Currently, it's the lawyers grabbing the headlines who probably don't understand how to build product, probably wouldn't be able to build product themselves. So I'd like to hear more Jessica Powell's getting heard and not being drowned out by hype and hysteria and fear.
You're absolutely right, and we will link to those 4. And I think as a collection of people that you've interviewed, I think it's a fascinating group. And I think as well, especially as you say, getting to Ed, who recently, just this week, left Stability AI. But he also, the company he built before that in Duke Deck was a generative AI company. So he really has been at the forefront of technology as well, and probably understands generative AI better than most people in the space. Yeah,
it's a big loss for Stability, but it'll be interesting to see where he goes next. He's a restless soul, so it'll be interesting to see where he applies it. Maybe just to kind of offer a very quick historical context on this.
Yeah.
There's 2 points in history which kind of spring to mind with AI. One, in the 80s when dance music became a thing. Remember life before dance music? What did we do? Did we dance?
We just listened to classical music.
But with dance music, the Musicians' Union had a campaign called Keep Music Live and tried to boycott dance music from the BBC because it put live musicians out of work.
Yeah.
So, what did Mark Twain say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure hell rhymes. And then secondly, I always remember the story of Eddie Kramer, who I think worked with Jimi Hendrix in the 60s here in the UK, and he had a sign above his office which said, "The day we can get computers to replace drummers is when we have a proper music industry." So I just think a little bit of historical context helps us understand where AI is taking us next. This is a continuation. This is not a revolution.
Yeah, I think that's smart as well. And, I spoke on a panel the other day with somebody who does AI-generated avatars and AI-generated influencers. And that, to some people, sounded really shocking. And I was like, did we all forget the gorillas? Did we all forget that happened? Like, we were all supposed to follow that as a fictitious band. And so, like you say, there's very little new in our world. It's often a reinvention.
And if you look over the garden fence at other industries, if you think about the GitHub Copilot story, when that broke, it was Armageddon for coders. Coders are dead. Coders are redundant. Coders get a job in a shoe shop. You're not going to be needed anymore. I can tell you, hands down, coders today are saying they're 4 times more productive than previous thanks to GitHub Copilot. So the pace you can go from a threat to an opportunity is measured in weeks or months, not years now.
And I think that's where the entrepreneurs sit, right? The people that you've interviewed on the podcast are all the people that I would say are focused on the opportunity within the threat.
Yeah. If all those kids who are making video content were then allowed to make music content, how many more Adeles would we discover if they did?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, this is a breeder ground for signing genuine human talent that's going to rise above the crowd.
Yeah. So a beautiful segue for me there, Will, with your mentioning of Adele. I'm going to flip us on to a little bit of women in music, because you were in Denmark just last week. Tell me a little bit about that keynote.
It's really, really important for me. I was invited by DR, which is the equivalent of the BBC in Denmark, to come and address this issue of women in music. And I thought to myself, it's always interested me, issues of gender in music, but I've never really given it the time of day. Anecdotally, I'll read an article, a long form essay on this topic. I'm not going to exaggerate. It wouldn't really go much further. I've done a lot of mentoring for women in the music industry as well. I'm very passionate about teaching at university, and especially seeing, recently taught a class that's doing music management and 60% female. I'm not making a genderist statement here, but it's just refreshing to see.
Brilliant.
It was balanced.
Yeah.
It wasn't 98% blokes. So it's always been on my mind, but to be asked to go to Denmark and address this very prestigious event in an incredible building, the Concert House in Denmark, one of the most remarkable venues I've ever stepped into. And I wanted to give the audience something to think about. So on the first point, I made them think about fairness issues, such as a debate that you're well au fait with, user-centric versus pro-rata versus artist-centric. What is a fair way to distribute royalties?
Yeah.
That is a fairness discussion. Then I wanted to think about diversity. So I brought in Glocalisation as a way of thinking about why are all the bands I'm going to see tonight in Copenhagen Danish bands singing in Danish. I'll sing along with the lyrics, but it'll sound like I'm gargling Listerine because I don't speak Danish. So that brought in diversity in a very nice, passive way. But then I wanted to produce data to understand, is there an imbalance in gender? Is it an imbalance we should be concerned about? And is there anything you can do about it? That structured three-way steps of asking the question. And the one that got me was, there are lots of examples in history of men writing for women and writing hits.
Yeah.
There's very few examples of women writing for men.
Interesting.
And when you do see women get to the top of the charts as singer-songwriters, it's because they wrote for themselves. And I felt that was just a very interesting imbalance to present to this audience, to say, as The Economist, as I did with Glocalisation, here's where I start and here's where I stop. Now I'm going to give you the baton to say, what can you do about that?
Yeah.
It could be for their brilliant collecting society, CODA, the equivalent of our PRS, or ASCAP for Americans who are listening, to do something about how they assemble writer camps. It could be many other ways of thinking about soft or hard forms of intervention in the market. But there's a very explicit imbalance. It's not uncommon for women to be performing hits written by men. It's very uncommon for men to be performing hits written by women. And I would love to see there's something the reception that I got from that audience was phenomenal. And it kind of makes me hungry to explore how can economics help look at ways, options to address that imbalance. It matters to me.
I think it's fascinating as well, because as you were saying it then, and you were saying that there are, examples of men writing hits for women, in my head I'm going, yes, Prince writing Nothing Compares to You, performed by Sinead O'Connor. Just so many examples off the top of my head. And then when you flipped it and said, there aren't as women writing for men, and I actually can't think of an example off the top of my head, which is only anecdotally proving the point, but it's got me thinking about the why as well, so that's where you've passed on the baton, and this is hot off the press, as we kind of delve into this. I wonder, like you say, where are the opportunities coming from, the songwriters camps, as you say, because there's no reason why it should be that way around.
And it might just resolve itself and doesn't require an intervention. It might require a nudge. You just don't know. You have to be very careful, cultural industries, thinking that's an imbalance and I'm going to solve it this way.
Right.
A quick example of, where the best intentions can go awry. When Canada regulated its radio industry, they said 35% of radio airplay has to be Canadian content.
Yes.
And here's our definition for Canadian. Bryan Adams, by the way, was declared not Canadian because he wrote with a British guy. Imagine going up to Bryan Adams, a Vancouver born and bred, you're not Canadian. And then what did radio stations do? They played Nickelback between midnight and 6 a.m. I filled up my quota. So just to illustrate, we're not regulating telecoms here, we're regulating culture. And you have to be very sensitive in these issues. But when you can spot an imbalance that's real, that's meaningful, I think that merited presenting to those 700 people in Copenhagen last week. I'm really proud of the work. First time I've done it, and I want to do more of it.
Fantastic. No, I loved hearing about it. So just for the last couple of questions,
sure.
I got some quick fire style type questions.
Guilty, not guilty.
So the first thing I want to know, and we've asked this to all the guests as well.
Sure.
So that's the kind of the format. So in 5 years, when we're looking back on 2023, what do we think will have been significant in the music industry? Will we be able to say 2023 was the year that? What do you think is going to be that statement?
I think this is the year that we realise that just about everybody who wants a music subscription account has got a music subscription account. Or as I like to say, herbivores turn into carnivores. The only way that you can grow this music subscriber market is by me stealing some of Hazel's customers or Hazel stealing some of mine. I think this is a year where we realise what saturation point really means.
Fascinating. I also believe that to be true, but very few people I feel are bold enough to say it.
I'll call it out. I think I'm seeing it happen in Britain and America just now. There are examples of some services growing and others contracting, which is a clear sign of just, half, 2/3 of the population are now using these services. The remainder are just not interested enough. And that's where we behave like telcos. You know, the only way that Virgin can build customer base is stealing Sky's customers. Sky would steal Virgin's customers, and you can apply that to Germany or America, wherever you're listening from.
Because everyone has a mobile subscription. So
Yeah.
pretty much. Fascinating. Okay, second question. What are your predictions for 2024?
My predictions would be... I believe one curveball prediction is I really do believe that we're going to work out a way of getting music into podcasts. I say that ironically as we sit here doing a podcast and we can't have a soundtrack. It's so strange. I mean, did you notice that of the top 20 podcasts in Britain this year, Desert Island Disc was 7th? And Desert Island Disc comes without the music. And for your audience's benefit, Desert Island Disc is an intimate interview between Hazel and Will, and we have songs to soundtrack your life.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, for Christ's sake, if that podcast is that popular, why can't we just put the music in?
Yes.
So my big prediction would be, if listening hours is flat, broadly speaking, people with streaming services spend 8 hours a week with them, exactly the same as they did in 2009, hasn't budged a minute. And podcasts are asking for 40 minutes of your time, a song's asking for 4 minutes of your time. Then you can bring a horse to water or water to the horse. And if we go with the latter, how do we roll music back into podcasts and win attention that would otherwise be lost?
I love it. I love it. Yes, how true. Listening to Desert Island Discs without the music, it's there. They'll just describe it to us, or you can find it in your own time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Will. It's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. As always, super, super enlightening. We're going to include all the links there, both to your book and to your podcast as well. And I just really want to thank you on behalf of SoundCloud for sharing your time with us today.
Grand stuff. And I go from here down to King's Cross to collect my mum as she's passing through Darlington right now.
Excellent. Always love a little mention of Darlington. Thank you so much, Will.
Take care. Bye-bye.